May 1945. The Reich is finished. Across Europe, the men who built it, who ran it, who carried out its orders with professional efficiency and ideological conviction, are making calculations. Fast, desperate, survival calculations. The kind of calculations that strip away everything, ideology, loyalty, identity, the entire constructed self of 12 years, and reduce a human being to a single question. How do I get out of this alive? Some of them are burning documents. Some are changing into civilian clothes and attempting to disappear into the tide of displaced people flooding through Central Europe. Some are heading for the ratlines, the escape routes through Italy and Spain that will eventually carry dozens of wanted men to South America and beyond. Some are already dead by their own hand, having made the calculation that surrender meant something worse than death. And some of them are doing something else entirely. Some of them are thinking about what they know, what names they can give, what operations they can describe, what colleagues they can hand over to Allied investigators, in exchange for the one thing that matters more than anything else in May 1945. If you are a senior SS officer with blood on your hands, survival. There is one man among all the senior figures of the SS whose post-war trajectory is more disturbing, more revealing, and more morally complex than almost any other. A man who had been one of Himmler's most trusted and most brutal commanders. A man whose name appears in the documentation of some of the most catastrophic acts of violence committed by the Nazi regime against civilian populations. A man who understood, with remarkable clarity and remarkable speed, how to transform from perpetrator to witness, from defendant to prosecution asset, from the man in the dock to the man pointing at others from the stand. His name was Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, and his story is not a story of escape. It is a story of something in some ways worse than escape. It is a story of transformation, of a man who looked at the wreckage of everything he had served and decided that the most useful thing he could do with what he knew was spend it, trade it, deploy it as currency in the marketplace of post-war accountability, buying his own freedom with the freedom of others. It worked. That is what makes this story so difficult to sit with. It worked. To understand what Bach-Zelewski was, you need to understand what the SS was at its most operational, not as an ideological movement, not as a bureaucratic structure, but as an instrument of violence deployed against human populations. Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski was born in 1899 in Lauenburg, in Pomerania, into a family of mixed German and Polish noble ancestry, a biographical detail that would become the subject of considerable uncomfortable attention in his post-war years, when the man who had overseen the systematic destruction of Polish civilian populations was revealed to have Polish blood himself. History does not traffic in irony so much as it accumulates it. He served in the First World War as a young officer, fought in the Baltic campaigns of the early post-war period, and eventually found his way into the Nazi Party and the SS in the early 1930s. His rise within the SS was steady and significant. He became an SS Gruppenführer, then an SS Obergruppenführer, one of the highest ranks available. He was, by the late 1930s, one of Himmler's trusted senior commanders, a man who had demonstrated the combination of organizational ability and ideological commitment that the SS rewarded. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Bach-Zelewski received a command that placed him at the operational heart of what the Nazi regime was doing in the occupied East. He was appointed Higher SS and Police Leader, HSSPF, for Russia Center. The title requires some unpacking. The Higher SS and Police Leaders were Himmler's direct representatives in the occupied territories. They commanded not just the regular SS security forces, but the police battalions, the Einsatzgruppen, and whatever auxiliary formations were available. They were responsible for security, a word that, in the context of the occupied Soviet Union, meant something specific and terrible. It meant the suppression of partisan activity, the pacification of civilian populations suspected of supporting resistance, the enforcement of the racial and ideological policies of the occupation regime, the coordination of mass killings. The Einsatzgruppen that operated in Russia Center during the summer and autumn of 1941 killed on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. They moved behind the advancing German army, gathering Jewish communities, Soviet officials, and anyone else designated as a threat, and shooting them. The numbers accumulated rapidly. Thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. Bach-Zelewski's area of responsibility was one of the killing grounds. His precise role in ordering and coordinating specific operations has been debated by historians, as has the degree of his direct personal command responsibility for individual massacres. What is not in dispute is that he was the senior SS and police authority in that region during that period. He attended briefings where killing operations were discussed. He was informed of the results. He reported upward to Himmler. He operated within and helped maintain the command structure through which the killings were organized. And then, in February 1942, something happened that is strange and revealing in equal measure. Bach-Zelewski suffered a breakdown. He was hospitalized, reportedly with severe psychological and physical symptoms: stomach cramps, hallucinations, reported nightmares. He was treated by an SS physician. The diagnosis, in the medical language of the time, was vague. But the context was not. Here was a man who had been in close proximity to mass killing for months, who was in some form of psychological collapse, and who required medical intervention before he could continue his duties. Himmler visited him in the hospital. The SS chief expressed concern. The episode was managed discreetly, as such episodes were. The machinery of the regime had no use for commanders who publicly acknowledged the psychological cost of what they were doing, because acknowledgement was itself a kind of testimony. Bach-Zelewski recovered. He returned to duty. The fact of the breakdown is worth examining, not to generate sympathy. A man's psychological distress does not mitigate his responsibility for what he ordered or permitted, but because of what it reveals about the human reality of the system. People broke under it. Even the perpetrators, the architects, the senior commanders, the system exacted a psychological price that sometimes became visible, as it did with Bach-Zelewski. The machinery of mass murder was not operated by people who were simply indifferent. It was operated, at least in part, by people who were in various states of psychological damage, damage that the regime suppressed, managed, and pushed through in the service of continuing the operation. By 1943, Bach-Zelewski had been given a new role that would cement his historical reputation and ensure that his name would be associated with two of the most significant episodes of organized violence against civilian populations in the European War. He was appointed head of the anti-partisan warfare operations for the entire Eastern Front. Anti-partisan operations in the occupied Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe were not, in their actual conduct, primarily military operations against armed resistance forces. They were operations in which civilian populations were treated as collectively responsible for partisan activity, in which villages were burned, populations were killed or deported, and entire regions were depopulated as a method of denying the partisans their human infrastructure. The numbers are staggering. The estimates of civilian deaths attributable to anti-partisan operations in Belarus alone run into the hundreds of thousands. Communities that had existed for generations were erased in operations that were given names and assigned to specific units and conducted according to orders that moved up and down the same command structures that Bach-Zelewski inhabited and helped to maintain. He was, in this role, not a man who was peripherally connected to atrocity. He was a man who was professionally, institutionally, and operationally central to it. His job was to organize the suppression of resistance. The methods used to organize that suppression included the systematic killing of civilians on a massive scale. And then came Warsaw. August 1944. The Polish Home Army launches the Warsaw Uprising, a massive, heroic, and ultimately catastrophic armed insurrection against the German occupation of the Polish capital. The uprising is one of the most significant acts of resistance in the entire Second World War. The fighters of the Home Army, knowing the odds, knowing what German reprisals would mean, chose to fight. They fought for 63 days. The German response was commanded, in significant part, by Bach-Zelewski. Himmler's initial response to the uprising was a declaration of intent so extreme that even some German military commanders were reportedly disturbed by it. The city was to be completely destroyed. The population was to be dealt with as the regime's policies required. The uprising was to be crushed with a totality that would serve as a demonstration to every occupied population of what resistance cost. Bach-Zelewski was placed in overall command of the operations to suppress the uprising. The forces at his disposal included some of the most brutal units available to the German military, units with documented records of atrocity, including formations led by individuals who would themselves become subjects of post-war investigation and prosecution. What happened in Warsaw over those 63 days and in the systematic destruction of the city that followed is part of the permanent record of the war's horror. Tens of thousands of civilians died. The city that survived the uprising was then methodically destroyed, block by block, building by building, the German forces working through it, with an organized thoroughness that left Warsaw one of the most completely demolished cities in the history of warfare. An estimated 85% of the city was destroyed by the time German forces were done with it. Bach-Zelewski commanded the overall operation. He was also in one of those historical details that complicate any simple narrative, the officer who eventually negotiated the terms of the Home Army's surrender. Terms that were notably more humane than what Himmler had initially demanded. He granted the fighters prisoner of war status rather than treating them as terrorists to be summarily executed. Whether this was driven by pragmatic calculation, by a genuine flicker of professional military honor, or by the beginning of the long process of self-repositioning that would define his post-war conduct, is a question that cannot be answered with certainty. What it created was a paper trail, documentation, a record of Bach-Zelewski acting in ways that could later be cited, in the right context, as evidence of a certain kind of moderation, a certain willingness to apply limits, material that a skilled man could use in constructing a post-war narrative of himself. By late 1944, Bach-Zelewski could read the strategic situation with the same clarity that any competent senior officer could read it. Germany was losing. Not perhaps losing. The Soviet forces that had been held, pushed back, and bled for years were now advancing, with an unstoppable momentum. The Western Allies had broken out of Normandy and were moving through France toward the German border. The Reich that had seemed, in 1942, to extend from the Atlantic to the outskirts of Moscow, was contracting back toward its original borders with a speed that made the eventual outcome obvious to anyone willing to look at the map honestly. Bach-Zelewski looked at the map honestly. He had spent years in the service of a regime that was now demonstrably failing. He had an operational record that, if examined in any post-war tribunal, would be catastrophic. He was not a desk officer whose role could be minimized or obscured. He was a field commander whose name appeared in orders, in operational reports, in the documentation of large-scale atrocities. He was, in a word, exposed. The question was what to do about it. Some of his colleagues in the senior SS were in various states of denial, maintaining the ideological commitment, believing in the Führer's assurances, pushing forward toward a final victory that the map had already made impossible. Others were making their escape plans, the documents, the identities, the routes. Bach-Zelewski was making a different kind of plan. He began, carefully and methodically, to construct a new version of himself. This process was not announced. It did not involve dramatic gestures or public declarations. It worked through the accumulation of small actions and positions and documented behaviors that could, in the right post-war context, be assembled into a narrative. He had negotiated humane surrender terms for the Home Army. He could claim to have had doubts about certain operations. He could position himself as a professional soldier who had followed orders within a system, rather than an ideological fanatic who had driven that system. He could become, in the language of post-war legal proceedings, a witness rather than a defendant. He had something valuable to offer. He had information. He had been at the center of the SS's operational machinery for years. He had attended meetings, received briefings, signed documents, and maintained relationships with nearly every significant figure in the Himmler apparatus. He knew things. He knew names, dates, operations, decisions. He knew who had ordered what and when and why. That knowledge was currency. And Bach-Zelewski was a man who understood currency. The end of the war came. Bach-Zelewski surrendered to American forces. He was taken into custody. He was interrogated. And then, something began to happen that would define the rest of his life, and that would stand as one of the most morally troubling episodes in the entire history of post-war accountability. He started talking, not reluctantly, not under particular duress, with a degree of cooperation and detail that the Allied investigators found, whatever their feelings about the man providing it, genuinely useful. He provided testimony about Himmler, about the operational structure of the SS, about the Einsatzgruppen and how they had been organized and commanded, about the anti-partisan operations and the decisions that had driven them, about specific individuals, specific orders, specific events. He appeared as a witness at the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, the main trial, the trial of the major war criminals. He sat in the witness box and provided testimony that was used against defendants, including Hermann Göring and others. He was, by any assessment, a significant and valuable prosecution witness. He provided the kind of operational detail and insider perspective that documentary evidence alone could not fully supply. He put flesh on the skeleton of what the documents showed. He connected names to decisions, decisions to outcomes. He was articulate. He was composed. He was, in the specific performance of being a witness, remarkably effective. And he was, during this period, not in the dock. He testified in subsequent Nuremberg proceedings as well. In the Einsatzgruppen trial, in which the commanders of the mobile killing units were prosecuted, Bach-Zelewski's testimony was again significant. He provided accounts of meetings and briefings that established the command structure and the knowing participation of the defendants in mass killing operations. The defendants in the Einsatzgruppen trial were convicted. 14 death sentences were handed down, 4 were carried out. Bach-Zelewski was not among the defendants. He was in the witness box. The moral arithmetic of what Bach-Zelewski was doing deserves to be examined directly, because it is deeply uncomfortable, and because the discomfort is the point. He was providing testimony that helped convict men who had been his colleagues, his subordinates, his fellow participants in the same system of organized violence. He was describing operations in which he himself had been involved in a way that positioned him as an observer and coordinator, rather than as a driver and perpetrator. He was using his knowledge of crimes in which he bore significant responsibility, to prosecute others while protecting himself. This was not, in a legal sense, a secret or a deception. The Allied prosecutors knew who Bach-Zelewski was. They had access to his record. They knew his role in Russia Center and in Warsaw. They made a calculation, the kind of calculation that prosecutorial systems make when they decide that the testimony of a participant is valuable enough to justify some degree of leniency toward that participant. The information he could provide about higher-ranking or equally culpable figures was worth something. Getting convictions of defendants who might otherwise have been more difficult to convict required witnesses who had been inside the system. It is the logic of the cooperating witness. It operates in criminal justice systems around the world. It produces results, convictions that might not have been obtained otherwise. And it always involves the same uncomfortable trade. Someone whose own hands are not clean is given something in exchange for information about others whose hands are equally or differently not clean. The question is not whether this logic is understandable. It is. The question is whether the specific application of it in Bach-Zelewski's case produced a just outcome. And the answer to that question is genuinely disturbing. He was not tried at Nuremberg. He was not tried in the immediate post-war period. He gave his testimony, positioned himself as a useful witness, and moved into the post-war world with a freedom that his record would not, in a purely just accounting, have entitled him to. The story does not end there. West Germany, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, began a process of more systematic prosecution of Nazi-era crimes, a process driven partly by genuine moral reckoning and partly by the international embarrassment of having allowed so many perpetrators to live comfortably in post-war German society. The Central Office for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes, established in 1958, began opening cases that the immediate post-war justice system had not reached. Bach-Zelewski's name was in those files. In 1961, he was tried in West Germany in connection with the murders of German communists in the 1930s, killings that had occurred before the war, in the period of the regime's consolidation of power. He was convicted. He received a sentence. He served part of it. In 1962, he was tried in connection with his role in the killing of political prisoners during the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, the purge in which Hitler had eliminated the SA leadership and various other political enemies. Bach-Zelewski had participated in these killings. He was convicted again. The sentences he received were not commensurate with the full scope of what he had done. The crimes for which he was finally prosecuted, the 1930s political murders, were serious, but they represented a fraction of the accounting that his complete record demanded. The mass killings in Russia, the anti-partisan operations, Warsaw, these were not the subjects of the prosecutions that eventually reached him. He died in 1972 in Munich, in a psychiatric facility where he had been receiving treatment. He was 72 years old. He died having served time in prison, unlike de Grelle, who died entirely unpunished. He died having been convicted, unlike many of his contemporaries who were never prosecuted at all. But he died without having fully answered for the full scope of what he had done. The prosecutions that reached him addressed parts of his record. The core of it, the operational responsibility for mass violence against civilian populations on a scale that made him one of the significant perpetrators of the Eastern Front, was never the subject of a verdict that bore his name. There is a particular kind of survival that is worse, in some ways, than the survival of the man who simply runs and hides. The man who hides under a false name in Buenos Aires is, at least in some sense, acknowledging what he has done by running from it. He knows why he is hiding. He knows what he is hiding from. The act of concealment is itself a form of testimony, an implicit admission that the thing he is concealing is something that the world would hold against him. Bach-Zelewski did not hide. He did not conceal. He walked into the post-war world and made himself useful. He sat in courtrooms not as a defendant, but as a witness. He provided the names and the facts and the operational details that helped convict his former colleagues. He constructed, through the act of testimony, a role for himself in the narrative of post-war justice that was on the right side of the ledger, on the side of accountability, on the side of truth-telling, on the side of the men and women who were trying to build a record of what had happened. He used the truth about other people's crimes as a shield against accountability for his own. This is not a simple moral situation. The testimony he provided was real. The convictions it helped secure were real. The historical record it contributed to establishing is part of the foundation on which our understanding of how the Holocaust and the broader program of Nazi mass violence actually operated is built. None of that can or should be discounted. But it was also self-serving in a way that was entirely conscious. He was not confessing. He was performing. He was doing what he had always done, reading the situation, identifying where the power lay, and positioning himself accordingly. In the 1930s, the power lay with Himmler and the SS. In the 1940s, with the operational command structure of the Eastern Front. In 1945 and beyond, the power lay with the Allied prosecutors and the new legal frameworks of post-war accountability. And Bach-Zelewski adjusted. He always adjusted. That quality of adjustment, the ability to read the room and reposition with it, is, in the context of ordinary professional life, a form of social intelligence. In the context of Bach-Zelewski's career, it is something darker. It is the ability to participate in atrocity when atrocity is what the system rewards, and to perform accountability when accountability is what the system requires. It is the quality of a man whose moral framework is not internal but external, whose behavior is determined not by conviction but by calculation. The question that Bach-Zelewski's story ultimately poses is not a comfortable one. It is not. Was he guilty? He was guilty. The record is clear. The documentation is extensive. The operations were real, and the deaths were real, and his role in both was established beyond any serious historical dispute. The question is, what does it mean that his guilt was only partially addressed by the justice system that was specifically designed to address it? And the answer to that question requires looking at the system rather than just the man. The Allied prosecutors at Nuremberg were not naive. They knew who Bach-Zelewski was. They knew that using him as a witness meant giving him something in return for his testimony. They made a pragmatic calculation that the convictions they could obtain with his help were worth the cost of not prosecuting him. And in terms of the immediate results of those specific trials, the calculation had a certain logic. But the longer-term effect was to create a precedent, to demonstrate that a man with Bach-Zelewski's record could navigate the post-war justice system, not as a defendant, but as a participant in prosecution. That knowledge, that testimony could be currency, that cooperation could be exchanged for partial protection, was not lost on others. It entered the institutional memory of how post-war accountability worked. It shaped the calculations of other men in similar positions. More fundamentally, it reflected a structural limitation in post-war justice that Bach-Zelewski did not create, but that he was exceptionally skilled at exploiting. The post-war justice system was trying to prosecute an unprecedented scale of organized state criminality with limited resources in a limited time against a very large number of potential defendants. It had to make choices. It had to prioritize. It had to decide which cases it could make, which witnesses it needed, which trades were worth making. Those choices were not made carelessly. They were made by serious people with genuine commitments to accountability. But they were made in conditions of scarcity and urgency. And in those conditions, some men who happened to possess the right combination of knowledge and willingness to deploy it, found space to survive. Bach-Zelewski found that space, and he occupied it for the rest of his life. 1972. Munich. A man dies in a psychiatric facility. He is 72 years old. He has spent the years since the war navigating the institutions of post-war Germany with the same skill and adaptability that he deployed throughout his career. He has been convicted of crimes, the 1930s killings that were eventually brought to trial. He has served time. He has also spent years as a witness, as a source, as a man whose knowledge of the inner workings of the SS was considered valuable enough to purchase some degree of institutional protection. He has not been fully held to account. He never was. The men he helped convict, the Einsatzgruppen commanders, the defendants at Nuremberg, faced the full weight of the justice system. Some of them were executed. Some served long sentences. Their names appear in history as convicted war criminals. Bach-Zelewski's name appears in history as a witness, as a source, as the man who testified, as the man who, when the system needed someone to describe what had happened from the inside, provided that description, and who understood from the beginning exactly what he was buying with every word he spoke. Justice is not a machine. It does not run on fixed tracks from crime to punishment with automatic precision. It is a human institution operated by human beings, making human decisions under human constraints. Sometimes it reaches everyone it should reach. Often it does not. The gap between what justice requires in principle and what justice achieves in practice is a permanent feature of how the world actually works. Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski lived in that gap. He did not simply fall through the cracks of the post-war justice system. He understood those cracks, mapped them with precision, and positioned himself carefully within them. He was, in the end, a man whose greatest skill, the skill that had taken him from a junior officer to one of Himmler's senior commanders, was the skill of survival, of reading the room, of understanding what was required of him in any given moment, and providing exactly that. In the 1940s, what was required was brutality and organizational efficiency. In 1945 and after, what was required was cooperation and testimony. He provided both, and he survived. And the men who shared his table at briefings in 1941, who signed the same orders, who inhabited the same system of organized violence, some of them went to the gallows with his words echoing in the courtroom while he walked out. There is no clean lesson here, no satisfying moral resolution, no moment where the scales of justice balance perfectly and the record is complete, and everyone who should have answered has answered. There is only the record as it stands. A man who did what he did, a system that caught part of it and not all of it, a gap between accountability and justice that the specific circumstances of one man's survival made visible in the starkest possible terms. The world promised in 1945 that those responsible would answer. For Bach-Zelewski, the world kept part of that promise, only part, and the part it kept, he helped negotiate himself. That is the most disturbing thing that can be said about him. Not what he did in the war, others did comparable things and were fully prosecuted, but what he did after it. The cold, calculated transformation from perpetrator to witness. The deployment of other people's crimes as protection against accountability for his own. The survival instinct applied with such precision that it produced, in the end, a verdict that was partial when it should have been complete. Justice has a price. Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski knew exactly what that price was, and he paid less than he owed, much less